All right, hello everyone. This is your teacher, Phil Travis, and this is our first lesson for our terms, World History 112, and I'm going to try to do one of these each week. These will be hopefully no more than about 10 or 12 minutes long, these recorded lectures, and they're designed to give you a very brief overview of the subject matter, of part of the subject matter that we're dealing with for this week. And in this case, we're dealing with the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is a general period of transformation in Europe, and that's why you see religion, economics, policy, philosophy, science, and so on and so forth down in the subheading, because the theme here is transformation in general, but we're going to look particularly at the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation, some basic roots and themes. It has its origins in Central Europe, particularly within what we would call the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a Catholic empire. It was led by a monarch who affiliated his loyalty with the Catholic Church in Italy, and it began really in 800 AD or CE when Charlemagne accepted this position. The Holy Roman Empire during the High Middle Ages, approximately 1000 to about 1300 CE, the Holy Roman Empire became tremendously powerful, and the Catholic Church particularly wielded an unprecedented amount of power in Europe. And so the Protestant Reformation really comes about on a number of different levels as a reaction to the power of the Catholic Church and the increasing demands of the Catholic Church to secular leaders like Henry VIII, but also to Christians in places like Germany, like Martin Luther. Some of the actions they took that were causing the most controversy for people like Martin Luther, who is going to be, a central figure in this discussion, was the issue of indulgence, the issue of paying penances, that the church could raise money by demanding that people have to pay for their salvation, and that the Catholic Church can somehow guarantee their salvation through this act. You see in the top picture here is a picture of the Basilica at St. Peter's. I'm sorry, it's spelled wrong in the PowerPoint. But during this time, part of the reaction of Protestants was the fact that the Catholic Church effectively raised a tax on the people of Germany to build this massive and impressive dome. And it was an indulgence tax where they would be asked to pay. And if they did not pay, then the church would say that, well, the soul of your ancestors won't be able to pass into heaven, or your soul won't be able to pass into heaven. So it was a tax that the church claimed was going to somehow secure your salvation. Well, critics like Martin Luther questioned the validity of such rituals. Martin Luther in particular questioned whether or not the church could in fact guarantee salvation, and Martin Luther will criticize the church quite heavily for claiming to have a ability to manipulate the fate of one's soul. And so the central question of the movement is, what must I do to be saved? If these rituals of the Catholic Church and these demands of the Catholic Church don't result in my salvation, what does? And of course the answer for the Protestants was God's grace, that you cannot earn salvation, that it's only granted. Now this is a look at Europe in 1600, so it's about almost a century after the Protestant Reformation, which begins really in 1519. And you can see just how divided Europe becomes among different religious faiths. Now, of course, when you look at over in Russia, when you look at those Orthodox, that's not really relevant. That's not really part of the Protestant Reformation. But you look in Central Europe, around the Holy Roman Empire, England also, you see the development of a very diverse amount of religious faiths, and this diversity leads to conflict and some major changes, both in terms of leadership in major countries like England, both in terms of conflict and also in terms of the persecution of everyday people. The Protestant Reformation, occurring at the beginning of the 1500s, is one part of a movement of really accelerated technological change that we're really going to be looking at in this class quite a lot in the next several weeks. The 16th and 17th century technology was driving some tremendously huge transformations, transformations that make our world today, like transformations that establish the roots in many respects for the more modern things that have been done since. Some of the big technological game changers. We will talk about the steam engine during the Industrial Revolution. We'll be getting to that in a few weeks. We will talk about the telescope and the microscope, which was invented in the Dutch Republic. But with respect to the Protestant Reformation, the technology that is so significant that we need to think about is really the printing press. The printing press was really developed in Europe at least. Movable type print was developed in Europe by Johannes Gutenberg, and of course famous for the so-called Gutenberg Bible. Movable type printing was a technology that had roots earlier than Europe, as did many of the technologies that Europeans kind of took advantage of at this time. But movable type printing really made a lot of sense for the European alphabet, if you will. In China, movable type printing is not as efficient because you have so many different characters, but with the 26 character alphabet, printing movable type printing of this kind, where you had these movable blocks, it was a process, but it was far more efficient than hand copying things. Printing revolutionized communication, and it made it possible for Luther to present and promote his 95 Theses across Europe, his criticisms of the Catholic Church. The printing press made it possible in the future for revolutions like the American Revolution to really happen, because they were able to communicate with each other about major issues. Like Thomas Paine, for example, in the American Revolution was able to write and print and publish his ideas that were so influential in the decisions of individuals to join in that revolution. Mass communication is fundamentally important, and Gutenberg's printing press really allowed for the mass printing and publishing of Bibles as well as works of a wide array in the kind of native tongue. Before, everything was in Latin, and it was all copied by people associated with the church. Well, after the printing press, you really have an explosion of mass printing, and you even have the emergence of satire in writing, utopian novels, but like those written by individuals like Thomas More, was an example of this newfound almost pastime of writing and publishing. So printing really revolutionized not only the Protestant Reformation, but it transformed Europe as a whole. None of the great advancements of the science of science at this time would have been possible without the individual to print and publish the information. That's how scholars, whether it's historians or scientists, even today, that's how we communicate knowledge, is by researching and then writing and publishing, publishing in a form that other intellectuals interested in the subject can, read and consume and engage. So it's a very fundamental technological development. So obviously, why are these so significant? We've already mentioned. We'll talk about the steam engine with the Industrial Revolution in weeks ahead. We'll talk about science. But with the Protestant Reformation, we need to think in the background, what's happening here is a change in how we communicate, how we publish information. And this is a very, very significant development long-term for humanity. And it really makes the Protestant Reformation possible. This map just demonstrates to you where printing kind of centered. The large dark dots are where the printing press really started to, where publishing really started to emerge. And you can see how over the course of the 1400s to the 1500s, how printing just spread across Europe. And of course, it had tremendous ramifications. The beginning of the Reformation, in terms of date, really occurs in 1519. Of course, it had developed for some time, but really occurs in 1519. And the key kind of events were Martin Luther issuing his 95 Theses, which are really 95 criticisms of the Catholic Church, the Leipzig debate. These types of things were major events. And of course, Martin Luther was not the only reformer. But when you look at the Reformation as it begins to occur in the early 1500s, you find that it's really centered on a few key concerns or criticisms. One is the role of papacy, the role of the Catholic Church in controlling Germany, the area of Central Europe. Of course, Germany as a country did not exist, but the area of Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire that was, of course, controlled by the very powerful Habsburg king, King Charles V. But the Protestants, they wanted the Catholic Church out of Germany. They wanted greater freedom for the German people. They wanted the elimination of most sacraments, in fact, all sacraments except baptism and communion. Those are the only two sacraments acknowledged by the Protestants. And so, of course, the Catholic Church has 7 holy sacraments, and the Protestants regarded these sacraments as rituals that were created by the Church and were not, in fact, any factor in Christianity or in the salvation of one's soul. They were mere rituals, and the Protestants saw these types of rituals as tools of control by the Catholic Church. Protestants promoted the idea of salvation by grace, which meant that you can't achieve salvation by practicing rituals. Instead, it just is granted to you, and there's very little that a person can do to bring that out. Now, why is this significant in terms of the larger picture? Well, the Protestant Reformation, again, is happening in Central Europe, and this is the heart of what we call the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was, it has its origins in 800 AD or CE, when Charlemagne accepted the role from the Pope. However, the Holy Roman Empire really became an imperial domain. At this time, it's controlled by King Charles V, which is he's a Habsburg king, which is an Austrian house. But it's a very large kingdom, and it's a kingdom that rules. It's a Catholic kingdom, and it's a kingdom that rules via the authorization, if you will, of the Catholic Church. And so Protestantism, a break with the Catholic Church, was in effect also a rebellion, many rebellions within the realm of King Charles V. And King Charles V's, the Holy Roman Empire, is a huge empire. We're talking an empire that is all of Central Europe, parts of Italy, also Spain, and the Low Countries. And so it was a very powerful empire. Charles V, at this time, we'll later talk about European exploration, but Charles V, his empire extended all the way to South America and the powerful silver mines in Peru, which the Spanish had, of course, begun colonizing at this time. So the Protestant Reformation is ideologically and philosophically a very fundamental break from the Catholic Church, as well as a rebellion against what's perceived as excessive power. But it also triggers off a situation of revolutions and rebellions throughout Europe as King Charles V tries to maintain the stability of his kingdom, and smaller Protestant kingdoms try to break off and form their own independent identity. Now, there's a number of different reactions. The Catholic Reformation, the Catholic Church ultimately tried to tone down some of its, rigidity. However, it did this a little bit too late. It was far too late to prevent this loss of converts, which occurred during the Protestant Reformation. Of course, there's also movements like the Jesuits, a missionary monastic movement. Jesuits were Catholic monks, and they would travel throughout the world, taking the word of the Catholic Church as a way of promoting it and preserving and expanding Catholicism. And that was another reaction to this. And the Jesuits In as early as the 1600s, the Jesuits were traveling deep into North America, as far as the Pacific Northwest, and as far away also as China. There's also a war on heretics. Luther is a fugitive. You have the usage of what we might call the Inquisition. We need not call it the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition. It was a war on Protestants, on religious heretics, and part of this would have also resulted in witch hunts, but witch hunts too were common in Protestant societies, and we might say that the spike in witch hunting probably had something to do with the fracturing of belief systems and the difficulty of these new belief systems to deal with different ways of understanding the world. That's one way of thinking about it, but it's certainly, the spike in witch hunts is certainly a consequence of the Protestant Reformation. Of course, war is also a consequence of the Protestant Reformation too. There's many civil wars that are fought. Another way that the Protestant Reformation transformed the world was actually, we often think about the Protestant Reformation, we start thinking only about changes in religion, but it affects so many other strata of society, from the nation state to the international nation state system, to governments, and also to warfare. And the Protestant Reformation really unleashed really over 150-year long period of sporadic warfare across the countries of Europe. And this kind of culminated in the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was fought really in what is today Germany, but it was Central Europe. Germany as a country didn't exist. Germany was a collection of different kingdoms, the most significant of which was probably Prussia, which ultimately will be the kingdom that unifies Germany in the late 1800s. But the 30 Years' War was a conflict in which every European power, more or less, got involved in this conflict at one time or another and fought in Germany, initially through the advocacy of either militant Calvinism, militant Protestantism, versus militant Catholicism. And it began as a religious war, but eventually it turned in really to a war in which European nations were making war to try to take advantage of the situation in Europe. And as a result of this, the war was long fought, 4 phases, 30 years, very, very bloody. Many villages were destroyed, civilians were destroyed, killed in some cases. It was a bloody, hard-fought war that was really continent-wide, involving countries like Prussia, Scandinavia, Spain, France, and others. This conflict was ended. This is why it's so significant. Not only that it was a big conflict, it's significant also because it resulted in the first modern international agreement. So when you have a conflict, the way conflicts usually end are that the parties get around a table and they make an agreement, they make compromises, and they make an agreement, and they sign a peace treaty. The first time that was really ever done was with the Peace of Westphalia, which is in what is modern-day Germany. The Peace of Westphalia was a treaty. There was something like 120 participants, if I remember correctly, at the conference. Not all of them states, of course. Some of them were non-government organizations or agents. But they signed a peace treaty to end this conflict in 1648. And in so doing, the conflict really created the concept of national sovereignty. National sovereignty is the idea that every country in the world has a basic right to be free from another country infringing upon its territorial boundaries if that country has not made war against them. So another country, smaller country, is assured that another bigger country won't just attack them to steal their resources. This is like the basis for international law. The most fundamental principle is a right to national sovereignty. So if the international community recognizes a country as sovereign, theoretically that's supposed to guarantee that the territorial borders of that country are respected by other powers. They sought to create a balance of power where no one country would be powerful enough to dominate all the rest. The creation of national sovereignty was largely done was largely done through two new nations. One was Holland, or the Dutch Republic, and the other was Switzerland. And these two nations had become really the hub, in part, for much of the Protestant Reformation. And the Holy Roman Empire had fought, and the agents affiliated with the Holy Roman Empire had fought greatly to bring countries like the Dutch Republic back into the empire. And the Peace of Westphalia guaranteed the independence of the small North European Dutch Republic, which was the hub of intellectual and scientific revival during this period. If you wanted to build a telescope, you went to Holland, you went to the Dutch Republic. If you wanted to pursue philosophy, that's where you went. And the reason is because they were very tolerant of science in the Dutch Republic, and it had its sovereignty really established and recognized as a result of the Peace of Westphalia. The 30 Years' War also resulted in changes in military. You saw the widespread usage of gunpowder weapons. You saw a movement away from the old medieval style of warfare. Increasingly, you had, with countries like Prussia in the aftermath, you had the organization of drill masters, and you began to see professional trained militaries in some places like Prussia after the 30 Years' War to develop refined methods of engagement in the use of gunpowder weapons, which of course the muskets were highly inaccurate at that time by themselves, and so you had to train soldiers to behave as a unit and fire as a unit, and therefore maximize your the full potential of your military. Here you see just a map of the location of the 30 Years' War, and so you can see the Dutch Republic there, and you can see the Swiss Confederation to the south, and of course you can see all the advances of all the various countries that became involved in this conflict. Now, England is a unique case, and I use England here. I want to mention this kind of briefly, but this is very important because, I bet most of you know the story of Henry VIII, who sought to divorce his wife, and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow him to divorce his wife, and so he broke away from the church and got his own divorce, and he wanted to remarry, of course, Anne Boleyn, so that he might have a male heir. But the significance of this case, because the Anglican Church really is very ritualistic, it's not nearly as Protestant on the surface as the other sects of Protestantism. It's kind of like a watered-down Catholicism, honestly, in a way. I hesitate to say that, but it's not as tremendous a doctrinal separation as the other Protestant faiths. But why this is significant is because it's really the first time in which a major monarch in Europe, a secular monarch, was able to ignore the power of the Catholic Church, of the papacy, and establish their own direction. And that was a very important step, and it was a step that really established a precedent for the future, and that is the rising power of secular monarchs and the decreasing power of the Catholic papacy, and that was very significant. Of course, there's other significance to this in England as well. Of course, the English Civil War was a war that was fought largely over religion. Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, believed the Anglican Church was watered down in its faith, and these things led to civil war in England.